Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Patriots History. I am Larry Swikart, co-author of Patriots History of the United States, reading from the 15th anniversary edition. If you're on our newsletter list, we will send you the 20th anniversary edition in PDF form, which is basically a new chapter from 2018 to 2023 and a whole bunch of insertions throughout the book. Remember, also, I have a full curriculum in U.S. history with me teaching every lesson in high production video. And if you want world history, we have that for you too. 15 units with me teaching it in 15 videos, as well as, of course, as the written materials. Now, we are in the middle of the Civil War, and last time we just finished Gettysburg. Gettysburg was a serious defeat for the Confederacy. It could have been an absolute disaster if Meade had moved quicker and surrounded Lee before he was able to cross back into Virginia, but he didn't. And so Lincoln was looking for an opportunity to replace Meade with another general who had just won the battle at Gettysburg, taking the city by siege, and that would be Ulysses Simpson Grant. So we're picking up now on page 354 from Chicamauga to Charleston. Gettysburg and Vicksburg marked a congruence of the war effort, a deadly double blow to the hopes of the Confederacy, capping a string of battlefield failures that met the Confederates in 1863. By that time, Ulysses Grant commanded all the military operations in the West, and he promptly sent Sherman to open up the road to Atlanta and the Deep South. Then on March 10th, 1864, Lincoln appointed Grant as the supreme commander over all Union armies, and Grant, in turn, handed control of the Western War over to Sherman. William Tecumseh Sherman resembled Grant in many ways, not the least of which was his utter failure in civilian life as a banker and a lawyer. How much he owed his command to political favoritism, especially the influence wielded by his powerful brother, John Sherman, the new senator from Ohio, is not clear. Unlike Grant, however, Sherman was already a Republican and a member of the radical wing of the Republican Party that opposed slavery on moral grounds. But he was also a racist whose views of the inferiority of blacks, especially Negro troops, would bring him into constant friction with Lincoln, whom he despised. His unintended role in reelecting the president in 1864 nearly led him to switch parties, just as Grant had switched from Democrat to Republican almost over the same issues. Sherman's hatred of Lincoln, whom he labeled a black guerrilla, echoing terms used by McClellan, was exceeded only by his animosity toward the Confederates. Although he admitted that Lincoln was, quote, honest and patient, he also added that Lincoln lacked, quote, dignity, order, and energy, many of the traits that McClellan also thought missing in the president. In late 1861, facing Confederate troops in Kentucky, Sherman became delusional, plummeting into a deep clinical depression that left him pacing his residence all night long, muttering to himself and drinking heavily. Thus, the relationship between Lincoln and Sherman, both probably manic depressives, was even more complex than either man realized. It remains one of the astounding pieces of history that the Union was saved by two depressives and a partially reformed drunk, that being Ulysses Grant. After fighting effectively at Shiloh, Sherman received special praise from Grant and earned promotion after promotion. Grant named the red-haired Ohioan commander of all of the armies in the West in the spring of 1864 with instructions to create havoc and destruction of all resources that would be beneficial to the enemy. On May 4, 1864, with almost 100,000 men, Sherman stuck a dagger into the heart of the South by attacking Atlanta. Joe Johnston's defending Confederate armies won minor engagements, but the overwhelming Union advantage in men and supplies allowed Sherman to keep up the pressure when Johnston had to resupply or rest. Jefferson Davis blamed Johnston, removing him in July in favor of John Bell Hood. But the fact was that even a mediocre general would have crushed Atlanta sooner or later, and Sherman was no mediocre general. With Yankee troops on the outskirts of Atlanta, Hood burned the railroads and withdrew, and on September 1, 1864, Union forces entered the city. Offering the Confederates the opportunity to remove all civilians, Sherman announced he would turn the city into a military base. Hood, hoping to draw the federal troops away from Atlanta, moved around him to the north in an effort to destroy Sherman's supply lines. Sherman scoffed that he would, quote, supply him with rations all the way to Ohio if Hood would keep moving in that direction. Instead, Sherman headed south, preparing to live off the land and destroy everything the Union Army did not consume. War is hell, he soberly noted. Sherman's great victory at Atlanta constituted one of a trio of critical victories in late 1864, news of which reached Washington and the voters just as Lincoln was under political assault. One of Lincoln's detractors thus ensured his reelection. And by the way, Sherman, to this day, if you talk to any of the old Southern families, they don't mind Ulysses Grant. He's okay. But they hate Sherman to this day and think he was brutal, and because he just went through their country like a tornado and just tore up everything and destroyed everything in his path, and starved a lot of them. He didn't take their personal food, but he took away almost everything else. Okay, the header on page 355. Politics in the North. By early 1864, in retrospect, Union victory seemed inevitable. U.S. Navy ships blockaded southern ports, breached only occasionally and ineffectively by blockade runners. As we talked before, the blockade runners, as is their nature, tended to bring in luxury goods, fine combs and mirrors and dresses and so forth, as opposed to actual munitions and so forth, because it had a higher premium. It paid more. The Mississippi River now lay open from the Missouri to the Gulf, while Texas, Arkansas, and Louisiana were surgically isolated from the rest of the Confederacy. In the far west, small important battles there had ensured that New Mexico, Utah, and California would remain in the Union and supply the federal effort with horses, cattle, gold, silver, and other raw materials. Braxton Bragg's northern defensive perimeter had shrunk from Kentucky's border on the north to Atlanta. In Virginia, Lee's army remained a viable but critically damaged fighting unit. Northern economic might had only fully come into play in 1863, and the disparities between the Union and Confederate abilities to manufacture guns, boots, clothes, ships, and most important, to grow food, were shocking. Given such a string of good news, Lincoln should have experienced stellar public approval and overwhelming political support. In fact, he clung to the presidency by his fingernails. Some of his weakened position emanated from his strong support of the man he had named commander of the Union armies. Ulysses Grant and Abraham Lincoln rarely corresponded, though Grant tended to send numerous messages to Halleck, whom he knew would read them to Lincoln. A Douglas Democrat in 1860, Grant had nonetheless gravitated toward unequivocal emancipation, though he was not a vocal abolitionist. No one seems sure when he actually changed parties. Courted by the Democrats as a potential presidential nominee in 1864, Grant refused to be drawn into politics at that time, and in reality never liked politics, even after he became president himself. By the fall of 1864, though, Grant endorsed Lincoln indirectly in a widely published letter. When Hooker descended to the low expectations many had of him, Grant expected his friend John Reynolds to command the Army of the Potomac, but the position went to Meade. Even after Lincoln gave Grant overall command of the Army, he and the president were not particularly friendly, despite their similarities. For one thing, Mary Todd Lincoln, whose bitterness knew no bounds once it was directed at someone, despised Grant's wife, Julia. Grant intended to grind down the Confederates with a steady series of battles, even if none proved individually decisive. Grant's style caught the rebels off guard. One Confederate soldier wrote, "We had been accustomed to a program which began with the federal advance, culminating in one great battle, and ended in the retirement of the Union Army, the substitution of a new federal commander for the one beaten, and the institution of more or less offensive campaign on our part. This is the usual order of events, and this is what we confidently expected when General Grant crossed into the wilderness. But here is a new federal general fresh from the West and so ill-informed as to the military customs of our part of the country that when the Battle of the Wilderness was over, instead of retiring to the north bank of the river and awaiting development of Lee's plans, he had the temerity to move by his left flank to a new position and there to try conclusions with us again. We were greatly disappointed with General Grant, full of curiosity to know how long it was going to take him to perceive the impropriety of his course. This is a pretty funny letter, actually, written by this guy. The rebels quickly realized that the policy of pounding had begun and would continue until our strength should be utterly worn away, unquote. Grant's reputation began to suffer in May 1864 when he launched a new offensive through the Wilderness again. 2 days of bloody fighting at the Second Battle of the Wilderness ensued, and more bodies piled up. On this occasion, however, Grant immediately attacked again and again. At Spotsylvania Courthouse, Lee anticipated Grant's attempt to flank him to get to Richmond, and combat lasted 12 days. Despite the fact that Grant's armies failed to advance toward Richmond spatially, their ceaseless winnowing of the enemy continued to weaken Confederate forces and morale. It was costly, with the Union suffering 60,000 casualties in just over a month after Grant took over, and this politically damaged Lincoln. Continuing to try to flank Lee, Grant moved to Cold Harbor, where on June 1st, he sent his men against entrenched positions. Now, he had vowed to himself never to do this again after Champion Hill out in Mississippi, but he did it anyway. One Confederate watched with astonishment as what he called inexplicable and incredible butchery. Yankee troops, recognizing the futility of their assaults, pinned their names and addresses to their coats to make identification of their bodies easier. One of Lee's generals saw the carnage and remarked, "This is not war. This is murder." Grant lost 7,000 men to the Confederates' 1,000, the only battle other than Fredericksburg in which the Army in Northern Virginia achieved any significant ratio of troops lost to the numbers engaged in the entire war. Cold Harbor was the only action Grant ever regretted, a grand mistake of horrific human cost. Callous as it seemed, however, Grant had in more than a month inflicted on the Confederates 33,000 casualties, or more than Gettysburg and Antietam put together. Now, these were massive losses that Confederates could not absorb. Shifting unexpectedly to the south, Grant struck at Petersburg, where he missed an opportunity to occupy a nearly undefended city. Instead, a long siege evolved in which the spade took the place of the musket, unquote. Searching for a way to break through Lee's Petersburg fortifications, Grant received a plan from Colonel Henry Pleasants, a mining engineer in command of a regiment of Pennsylvania coal miners, who proposed tunneling under the fortifications and planting massive explosives to blast a hole in the Confederate defenses. On July 25th, the tunneling was complete and tons of black powder were packed inside the tunnel. Troops prepared to follow up, including at first a regiment of black soldiers who at the last minute, foolishly, were replaced on Burnside's orders, having not only trained for the mission, but possessing the only appropriate tools for smashing the Confederate fortifications, all of which were inexplicably left behind when the white troops took over. This was just a screw-up of unimagined proportions. Bill Fortune, whom I mentioned in the last video, co-author of the Gettysburg series, has a book called Cold Harbor on this. It's just, it's horrific. When the charge detonated, the explosive charge detonated on July 30th, a massive crater was blown on the rebel lines, and the advancing troops actually penetrated the Confederate lines and disorganized and insufficiently led stopped. They milled around and beyond the crater, allowing the Confederates to counterattack and then push them back into the yawning hole. Their Federal troops were slaughtered by rebels firing down at them. It was another disaster, costing the Union 4,000 casualties and an opportunity to smash through Petersburg's defenses. Since 1862, Lincoln had faced turmoil inside his cabinet and criticism from both the radical Republicans and the Democrats. Prior to 1863, anti-slavery men were angry with Lincoln for not pursuing emancipation more aggressively. At the same time, loyal war Democrats or Unionists who remained in Congress nipped at his heels for the Army's early failings, especially the debacles of McDowell, Burnside, and Hooker. Their favorite, McClellan, who scarcely had any better record, nevertheless was excused from criticism on grounds that Lincoln had not properly supplied him. McClellan had more than any of those guys. During the 1864 congressional election, criticism escalated and the Republicans barely hung on to the House of Representatives. Note that we had an election in the middle of a war. If you don't count the War of 1812 and the election of 1814, which you should, this is our first wartime election when we really had serious issues during the war. These and other Democratic gains reversed a series of 5-year gains for the Republicans, with the cruelest blow coming in Illinois, where the Democrats took 9 seats to the Republicans' 5 and won the state legislature. Without the border states, James G. Blaine recalled the hostile House might have overthrown his emancipation initiative. If the House losses were troublesome, Salmon Chase posed a genuine threat to the constitutional order. His financing methods have proven remarkably efficient, even if he ignored better alternatives. Yet his scheming against Seward, then Lincoln, was obvious to those outside the administration who wrote of the Chase faction, quote, "Their game was to drive all the cabinet out and enforce the reappointment of Mr. Chase as premier and form a cabinet of ultramen around him," unquote. Seward, tired of the attack, submitted his resignation without knowing the larger issues that swirled around him. Lincoln convened a meeting with several of the senators involved in the Chase schemes. Holding Seward's resignation in his hand, he demanded the resignation of all of his cabinet, which he promptly placed in the top desk drawer and threatened to use if he heard of any further intrigue. Lincoln's shrewd maneuver did not end the machinations by the radicals, but it severely dampened them for the rest of the war. An equally destabilizing issue involved the draft. Liberal Democrats and influential Republican editors like Horace Greeley opposed conscription. After the announcement of the first New York conscriptees under the 1863 Enrollment Act, some 50,000 angry Irish who saw that they were disproportionately represented on the list descended on the east side. Mobs, this is shown in the movie Gangs of New York, this particular riot. Mobs terrorized and looted stores, targeting blacks in particular. Between 25 to 100 people died in the riots. I mean, they crashed in on the houses of the wealthy and killed them. And the mobs did 1.5 million in damage, requiring units from the U.S. Army to restore order. The new Gatling guns, the world's first machine gun developed by American Richard Gatling, were turned on the rioting Irish. So this is the first time in the world that machine guns are used, and they're used on draft rioters. The rioters were in the unfortunate circumstance of confronting troops direct from Gettysburg, who were in no mood to give them any quarter. Another threat to the Union came from the so-called Peace Democrats, known in the North as Copperheads, for their treacherous, stealthy attacks. They're forming secret societies, including the Knights of the Golden Circle. Copperheads forged links to the Confederacy. How far their activities went remains a matter of debate, but Lincoln and Douglas both thought them significant. Peace Democrats propagandized Confederate success, recruited for the rebel cause, and in extreme situations even stole supplies, destroyed bridges, and carried correspondence from Southern leaders. Even when arrested and convicted, Copperhead agitators often found sympathetic judges who quietly dismissed their cases and released them. Does this sound like Washington today? At the opposite end of the spectrum, but no less damaging to Lincoln, were the radical Republicans. Congressional Republicans from 1861 onward clashed with the president over which branch had authority to prosecute the war. In May 1864, radicals held a meeting in Cleveland to announce their support of John C. Fremont as their presidential candidate in the fall elections. Rank-and-file Republicans who eschewed any connection to the radicals held what would have been, under other circumstances, the real Republican convention in June and renominated Lincoln. However, in an effort to cement the votes of war or Unionist Democrats, Lincoln replaced Hannibal Hamlin, his vice president, with a new nominee, Democrat Andrew Johnson of Tennessee. So this is really the first time since they changed the Constitution where you had a president and vice president of different parties at the same time. The main source of radical opposition to Lincoln targeted his view of reconstructing the Union. Radicals sought the utter prostration of the South. Many had looked forward to the opportunity to rub the South's nose in it, and Lincoln's moderation was not what they had in mind. Two of the most outspoken radicals, Benjamin F. Wade of Ohio and Henry W. Davis of Maryland, authored a bill to increase the number of persons required to sign loyalty oaths in the South to 50% and to ensure Black civil rights. The Wade-Davis bill flew in the face of Lincoln's consistently stated desire to reunite the nation as quickly and peaceably as possible, and would have provoked sufficient Southern antipathy to Lincoln the war through guerrilla warfare. So you always had to balance what would happen if you had like abolished the Democrat Party and basically declared it a terrorist organization, which would have been my view, and what would have happened if you had gone in and demanded, no, you got to have at least 50% of the people sign loyalty oaths to the Union, and basically put the warmongers from the Confederacy in jail, not just Davis, but many of the officers like Lee and others. Or whether you did what Lincoln wanted, which was to have a very easy reunification, to kind of turn a blind eye to some of the excesses of the Democrat radicals like the KKK and others, and to just, you know, with malice toward none, right? With charity for all, bring them back in. And you can look in hindsight and wonder what would have happened if he had actually banned the Democrat Party then as a terrorist organization. I don't know. But it's kind of returned to its roots in modern times. At any rate, yet Lincoln feared the Congress might override a veto, so he exercised a special well-timed pocket veto in which he took no action on the bill. Congress adjourned in the meantime, effectively killing the legislation, which infuriated the radicals even more. Wade and Davis issued the Wade-Davis Manifesto, which indicted not only Lincoln's plan for reunification, but also disparaged his war leadership. All these factors combined to produce a remarkable development in the late summer and early fall of 1864, in which some Republican Party members started to conduct a quiet search for a nominee other than Lincoln. So you believe this? They were actually trying to replace Abraham Lincoln as president. At the Democratic Convention in August, George B. McClellan emerged as the nominee. He planned to run on a restoration of the Union with no change in the Confederacy except that Richmond government should dissolve. Adopting a peace plank, Democrats essentially declared that 3 years of war had been for naught, that no principles had been affirmed. Here was an astonishingly audacious and arrogant man, an incompetent and arguably traitorous Democratic general running against his former commander-in-chief in time of war and on a peace platform 6 months before the war was won. The peace plank proved so embarrassing that even McClellan soon had to disavow it. Even so, facing McClellan and the peer of Republican Fremont, Lincoln privately expected to be voted out of office. Is that amazing? He thought he'd lose. About that time, Lincoln received welcome news that Admiral David Farragut had broken through powerful forts to capture Mobile Bay on August 5th, 1864. Threatened by Confederate torpedoes, actually mines, Farragut exhorted his sailors with the famous phrase, "Damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead." Other important Confederate ports, most notably Charleston and Wilmington on the Atlantic, held out but remained blockaded. With Mobile safely in Union hands, remember New Orleans is already in Union hands, the major Gulf Coast rebel cities had surrendered. Farragut's telegrams constituted the first of 3 highly positive pieces of war news that ensured Lincoln's reelection. The second was Sherman's early September report of the fall of Atlanta. Sherman recommended that Grant order him to march southward from Atlanta to, quote, cut a swath through to the sea, taking Savannah, unquote. In the process, he would inflict as much damage as possible, not only to the rebel army, but on Southern economy and war-making capacity. A third and final boost to Lincoln's reelection came a few weeks later from the Shenandoah Valley, where General Philip Sheridan was raising havoc. Between Stuart's loss at Yellow Tavern, remember Jeb Stuart, now he lost, and the destruction of the Shenandoah, Lincoln's prospects brightened considerably. And remember, Sherman didn't like Lincoln, and here he handed him a great victory. Still, Lincoln, the politician, took no chances, furloughing soldiers so they could vote Republican and seeing to it that the Loyalists in Louisiana and Tennessee voted, even though only the Union states counted in the Electoral College. McClellan, who once seemed to ride a whirlwind of support, saw it dissipate by October. Even Wade and Davis supported Lincoln, and Grant chimed in with his praise for the administration. Lincoln beat McDowell by 400,000 votes and crushed the Democrat in the Electoral College 212 to 21. McClellan's checkered career as a soldier politician had at last sputtered to an end. And this episode didn't sputter to an end, but we are at an end. So I will see you guys back here next time. Remember, if you need a full curriculum in U.S. history or world history, we've got it. No license to expire. Use it with as many kids as you want. Remember to subscribe to me on Substack. You will get all the free stuff I put on Substack, but you'll also get my in-depth political analysis and sometimes just fun on Substack. And remember, if you want more politics, go over to the Wild World of Politics and hit the insider button. Subscribe to that, just $6 a month, and you will get thrice weekly, that's 3 times, thrice weekly political updates and analysis. And I will see you guys back here on probably a week from Monday, probably next Monday. So I'm going to miss Friday because I have a speech in Santa Barbara. So I'll see you back here on Monday, the 21st, 22nd, 23rd, 24th. See you then.